Okay, welcome to the track 4 of our discussion of our conference. Track 4's title is Digital Diplomacy and Diplomacy by Video Conference. A quick intro is this morning I was, of course, as always, browsing the social media, and there was an interesting post by a colleague of mine who's former Minister of Education in Serbia, who noticed basically that till February, the antonym of online was offline, which comes from computer sciences basically being unplugged and so on. However, today, the antonym is increasingly on-site, which was, of course, used in different terms, in different conditions before, context before the cyber world. So this might mark a slight shift into how we perceive the future, and whether this on-site and online, where are we actually on, and what is more dominant, and what is the second range, and so on. So another term that I've heard is in person. And I wonder if those of you present wish to share in chat, what is your favorite term that you use these days when you want to mark that you're not conducting something online? Is it on-site? Is it in person? Is it offline? It's interesting to see the dynamics. At the same time, I mentioned the track is called Digital Diplomacy and Diplomacy by Video Conference. So the good question is, should we call it digital diplomacy? Should we call it e-diplomacy, virtual diplomacy, net diplomacy, video diplomacy? I don't know what it could be in future. And there will be then again the question for all of you: what term do you use? And feel free to have the to use the chat so extensively. Some of the questions we'll touch upon in the next hour is, as digital diplomacy or virtual cyber or e-diplomacy has become a buzzword, but it has been around for quite a while. It's not the first time the diplomats use the digital space, even though they are probably among the slowest ones to catch up. But to what extent actually this current crisis is pushing, as we can call it, a digitalization on steroids also in diplomacy and among the ministries of foreign affairs. So a couple of questions that we'll try to reflect one is, has this corona pandemic actually given a new impetus to the ministries of foreign affairs to pursue digital diplomacy? Is the future of diplomats and MFAs digital, cyber, virtual? Is it on-site or online? And if so, why? In addition to these questions, we have that the myths related to digital diplomacy exist, and we've touched upon some of them, whether they are myths or realities, such as there might be more transparency, there might be more inclusiveness, and so on. And so it's a good question whether these are the myths or the realities. And then further on a practical level, of course, what are the platforms? How to choose the platform? What are the security aspects? What will emerge maybe in future? We are witnessing the evolution of virtual reality, augmented reality. Will we end up in matrix scenario, and so on? Quite some set of interesting questions. But without further ado, I would like to move to the first part of the discussion, which is, as we titled, a digital diplomacy to the rescue. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Shaun Riordan. He's a director of the Chair for Diplomacy and Cyberspace at the European Institute for International Studies, Senior Fellow of the Charar Institute at Beijing, and a senior consultant with the UN Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, for digital and cyber diplomacy. Shaun, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being able to join. We don't have much time. We've organized it that we have about 15 minutes for each of the blocks, but I do encourage all of you. So we'll have an intro of each of the guests in each part of the session, but I encourage all of you to jump in with the comments in chat. If you wish to take a floor briefly and take a mic, you're free to do so, but just raise the hand. And my colleague Andriana, who is with me, will help with moderating the chat, passing on discussions to the floor in a way, or to the screen. Shaun, I won't take much time. I'll pass the floor to you with these opening questions. Is digital diplomacy coming to a rescue in these times of crisis? Sure.
In a sense, yes, in that we had a taboo in diplomacy against using digital technologies for negotiations, for multilateral meetings. There's this argument by diplomats that without face-to-face contact, without the huddle in the corner, without being able to use the discussions in the margins, you couldn't do real diplomacy. And we found that with COVID-19, because of the travel restrictions that were imposed, because of other restrictions in terms of meeting people, of social distancing and the like, that we cannot have these meetings. We're not able to have these big multilateral meetings. We're not able to fly around the world to meet on a routine basis. And so diplomacy has been forced to go online. And in that sense, I mean, the digital technologies have rescued diplomacy in that meetings continue to go ahead. That we've had an online Security Council meetings, we've had online European Council meetings, we've had an online UN General Assembly, which I actually thought was much better than the real thing. I served in New York in the British mission, and I remember sitting through a face-to-face UN General Assembly, which was the most wretched experience in the world, sitting listening to every world leader making an hour-and-a-half speech. And I thought limiting them to a 3-minute video was probably the biggest advance in United Nations in the last 50 years. But I think, yeah, in that sense, it has rescued diplomacy. The interesting question is where diplomacy goes from now, and to what extent we remain online, and how we get around the problems of not having the face-to-face contact and not being able to do the huddle in the corner.
Thanks, Shaun. And thanks for emphasizing again. We had it this morning, and this will probably be one of the main points of discussion even in our group today, is this corridor talks, this basically personal touch, this building relationships and trust, and to what extent we can do it online. But before maybe switching to that, I wanted to ask you, I got the impression that we are sort of, as diplomats or diplomacy, is pushed into digitalization in a way, or at least faster because of the pandemics. But did we consider to what extent the MFAs, the diplomats, have actually considered digital before? Not necessarily because they're forced, but because they can actually benefit from something which is out of digital, as the businesses and governments and many others are, education, many others are doing, even regardless of the pandemic.
I would say that actually diplomats have always been forced into digitalization. They've not taken to it naturally. They've been very reactive. They've tended to use off-the-shelf products rather than devising their own products. Generally, I think diplomats done really badly online before the virus. So we've seen diplomats thinking that you can use social media for public diplomacy, when actually it's not a terribly good way of doing public diplomacy. There are much better ways. But diplomats who think that being on Facebook has achieved all they need to achieve, putting some tweets out is great and you've done your job, not realizing that actually you have to learn how to use social media properly. So I think that the diplomats have not actually been very good at what they've been doing, with one exception, and the one exception is the consular work. And bearing in mind that political diplomats have always been a little bit snobby about consular work, about dealing with unwashed citizens and the like. Well, actually, the comeback is that the consular officers have been infinitely better at making good use of new technologies, particularly the use of social media for identifying where their citizens are or what problems their citizens have during crises like COVID-19. So I think it's time political officers have to give a little bow to the consular officers and perhaps learn a little bit about how to use technologies from them.
Like I wouldn't call it a concern of overdoing, over-tweeting. And that leads me to maybe a question as we sort of get the new generation of diplomats around missions around the world, people which are, let's say, digital natives more and more, maybe more prone to tweeting, Instagramming, or whatever, maybe even TikToking in future. And as we are more and more moved into these online tools, is there a risk that actually we will lose this part of personal touch and this segment of diplomacy which you mentioned is probably one of the most important aspects? Will we evolve into diplomacy which doesn't give that much attention and need to this personal context, corridor talks, and all that?
I think the danger comes not so much from the technology, but from governments not understanding the value of diplomacy. And I would say that the ideal arrangement is you start looking towards a hybrid diplomacy, where we go back to depending much more on embassies abroad. So that instead of flying around the world to summits or to meetings, which is quite a recent development. I mean, when I first started as a diplomat in the 1980s, the embassies did the overseas contact making. We did the cultivating. We spoke to the politicians. The ambassador knew all the ministers and would give the advice to the government on intentions and what the countries wanted to do. And that was also on the basis of knowledge of the language, knowledge of the culture. And that's kind of been downgraded over the last 20 years. We've seen the embassies become less important. Ambassadors have become ever less important and ever more micromanaged. And we've had people from headquarters ministries, as well as ministers and government leaders, absolutely convinced that they can fly around the world and with a little bit of face-to-face contact, they can identify intentions and motivations. I mean, famously, George Bush looking lovingly into Vladimir Putin's eyes and seeing the man's soul. I think he needs an eye test very rapidly after that particular encounter. But similarly with Trump meeting Kim Jong-un and thinking that they were now soul pals forever. So I think actually it's quite healthy if we can persuade governments that the embassies abroad have this really important role of maintaining the public or the personal relationships. The face-to-face diplomacy enables us to understand what's going on. And I think actually in the cyber world, it becomes even more important because cyber operations, cyber tools don't tell us about motivation. They don't tell us about intentions. And the risk of misunderstanding what's going on in the use of a particular coding, particular cyber operation, cyber penetration, where you might think it's being done for aggressive reasons when it's done for espionage reasons, or it's done as a warning, or enormous dangers of escalation in cyber conflict. And we really need those personal relationships so that you can go to an ambassador can say, no, that was not done as an aggressive act. It was done as a mistake. It was done as a misunderstanding, whatever. But I think that is going to be a crucial role of diplomacy. It has always been a crucial role of diplomacy. And I think getting it back into the embassies is quite healthy. I don't think we are going to fly around the world like we used to, simply because it's too expensive. We're going to have far fewer airlines. We're going to have to go through health protocols. It won't just be a question of a visa. You'll need to have a health check. It's just going to be ever more complicated to do. And I think foreign ministers have found that having meetings online is cheaper and more flexible. You don't need to take weeks to set up a meeting. You can do it instantaneously, and you can have people from all around the world, as we are today, in a meeting. It offers offers much in terms of flexibility and cost saving. I do take your point, Vlad, about a new generation growing up. I mean, my idea of playing games is to play chess on my mobile phone. That's about as far as I get. But then I'm a Cold War child, so chess was kind of important. But actually, a Cold War adult, I have to confess as well. But I think as we do get a new generation growing up, I think we are going to see changes. And where I really think we're going to see changes in things like policy debates, how we do the policy making process. Most foreign ministries still decide foreign policy the way that it was done when I started in 1984, on paper or on electronic versions of paper, setting out arguments, making a recommendation, backing it up with written arguments. Something that Jeffrey can talk about, because I've just been watching Jeffrey's new video, which is tremendous, about experimenting with games and computer games. In his case, it's for virtual conferences. But I think the idea of using games to explore policy spaces, using games to explore possible negotiating outcomes, particularly when we link this to artificial intelligence. I think that's where we're going to see new technologies, and particularly for generations who've grown up playing games. I go and look at a game and it takes me about 35 minutes to learn the rules, and after 20 minutes I give up because I can't be bothered. But we've got generations who've been playing games pretty much since they came out of diapers, and they I think are going to be changing the way that we do diplomacy, public diplomacy. The extent to which we've not used computer games yet in diplomacy, I find stunning. And I think that is going to be an area, and it's one where Jeffrey can tell us an awful lot more, because Jeffrey can give us a link to his video, but it really is a very interesting video on YouTube at the moment.
I'll talk to the
Jeffrey profile. Yeah, Jeffrey, go ahead. Go, Jeffrey, if you wish.
Yeah, I'll talk to the video later in my section. So we're going to go through all the different steps which I went through with a game developer to actually discuss how a diplomatic conference could actually work in a online, almost simulated environment, and it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing.
I should explain that Jeffrey and I did not set this up beforehand.
Now I doubt. It's okay. No, we'll have time for that. We have a devoted slot, not only for Jeffrey, but for this part of the discussion, which I think is really important when it comes to new technologies. We already exchanged some interesting emails before. I'll pass a quick round to Andrea to see what's happening in the chat, and then maybe a closing question to Shaun. Andrea.
Thanks for the floor, Vlada. We have a discussion in chat. We have greetings from Maria from Belgrade, who says that she uses the term digital diplomacy. And Little is also in favor of that term as well. And he also, I assumed he, I'm very sorry, they also highlight that COVID brought the need to use digital diplomacy not only as a platform, but as a working tool. This is a comment that I found interesting. Ricardo said that hybrid diplomacy is the key to the future, and we have agreement from Maria on that. But let me just go back to terminology real quick. Maria says that she uses online meetings, and the opposite of that would be face-to-face meetings. And as a native Serbian speaker, I'm very interested to know how she would translate that into Serbian. And the last comment that just came in is from Atef, who says that psychological factors are main reasons why many diplomats don't see digital technology as an effective tool in successful diplomacy. Over to you, Vlada. That's it for now.
Thank you, Andrea. Time is flying. I'll pass the screen back to Shaun for some sort of concluding remarks in this part. And I'm really glad that, or quite interested in what you mentioned, that we're basically coming back to the roots of the role of embassies, probably a different role of embassies, but coming back to the importance of embassies, and maybe a light reflection, what you mentioned when it comes to misunderstanding and closing the loop, talking about these corridor talks and a personal touch, to what extent we can avoid misunderstandings in personal communications if we do it online, and how different it is if we do it with a cup of coffee and possibility to spill that coffee to someone else and so on. Shaun, any final reflections on
I think this is why embassies are going to be crucial, that they're going to be doing the private coffee conversations. They're going to be doing the private face-to-face understanding of what's going on in the way that they always used to. Probably the only place where you really had the routine coffee conversations going back to the 80s and 70s was New York, in the United Nations in New York, which has an incredible number of coffee shops. So I think you will have, that will continue there. In the rest of the world, it's going to continue to between embassies and foreign ministries, embassies and other diplomats. But I think we're not going to see the flying around the world. That's going to be replaced much more by online. And also finally, to pick up a point that Jovan made to me when we had a session on this a couple of weeks ago, that actually getting the emotion out of diplomacy sometimes has its uses, or getting the emotion out of the negotiation has its uses. We had a technique which we've not used for a while, which was called proximity talks, where you precisely avoided delegations meeting each other to prevent emotion getting in the way. And this is how Holbrooke did Dayton, it's how Kissinger did his Middle Eastern talks, it's how Vietnam, US talks went on for years. So it's not necessarily a bad idea to get emotion out of international negotiations. Sometimes it helps. I think my final point is, when we're looking at all this new stuff, it's important to dig back into the history of diplomacy and to understand how we did stuff in the past. You know, diplomacy did not begin in 2015. It's got a long history, and much of what we're doing is adapting our diplomatic techniques to the conditions that we live in.
Thank you, Shaun. I'll have to complain to Katarina and the organizers for giving us only 15 minutes for that, even though we are already in 20. Thanks a lot for joining. I mean, stay with us. We're moving straight ahead to the second block, where we are touching upon more of the practical aspects of the communications in the current setting of the technologies. We'll look into the future a little bit later. And I welcome my colleague Arvin Kamberi, who is the head of the Diplo's webinar team. He's one of those folks from Diplo based in Belgrade as well. And he's been working on webinars and other web-based remote participation since 2011. So Diplo has quite a footprint in there. And he was one of the chief persons there. Arvin has been part of the remote participation team for many international forums, not least with the Internet Governance Forum of the UN, but also Eurodig and many local IGFs around the world, such as Africa. So let me give the floor, the screen then to Arvin with a clear, a question. So what are the opportunities and challenges that we actually have when it comes to multilateral diplomacy because or thanks to the online platforms? Arvin.
Thank you, Vlada. And first of all, really pleasure to speak at this panel. And I did actually prepare a bit of a detailed presentation, but now moved with this interaction with Shaun and others, I will just kind of shorten it up to leave a time for questions from the audience. And as Vlada mentioned, at Diplo, we are doing, let's say, participation via online tools in a different ways and for us for a decade now. And just to emphasize actually a couple of things that already mentioned by Shaun. The first one is that this is not a quite new thing, to be honest. I mean, it's there from 50s and 60s and the age of mass media and TV. So we do have a kind of an ITU representation of the delegates. They should go like a video or a television equipment, which was expensive, not so, let's say, not so available for everyone. But we did, even in 60s and with the rise of public diplomacy, of course, with mass media, we did have an eye in a conference room kind of as an observers. And if we wanted to engage in talks or whatever is happening in that room, but that was just an eyes and ears. What actually happened, 90s, let's say early 2000s, was basically this shift in paradigms from observing meetings, kind of observing what's going on, into participating, actively participating on an equal level. Of course, two major things was a kind of push for that. It's an introduction of Wi-Fi and internet in conference rooms. So this sudden urge to kind of tweet something from a conference room became like put a new shine on a base of public diplomacy and others. And on the other side, when those, let's say, office assets like a telephone or computer, which were kind of considered for office assets, became quite personal. Basically, meaning that people trying to connect and could connect from their phones, from their personal devices, computers, laptops. What is this change, or how it affects us? Basically, a couple of changes. But first, a significant change in how level of interaction. How do we interact into one room? And on another hand, which is really on a visual side, it's basically from 60s, 70s, 80s, focus was like on a wider shots, on a picture as a whole, or the whole conference room, etc. But with personalization of devices, we kind of now have these close-ups, personal meetings in which we can actually engage more, and kind of we now even see like a royal families with a close up, like really look, just being in room completely as a person. And so this timeline is actually kind of a story of us trying to be with all of our body into this meeting. How we can do that in future, of course, there are alternative places, etc. But we'll get that on later. But basically, also to reiterate a point from Shaun, earlier point from Shaun, when, of course, when global pandemic closed venues, closed our offices, etc., the set for perfect platform to meet demand was kind of on. And of course, we at Diplo offered a place for that, created an overview of available platforms and technologies which are there. And of course, you can find all that on our website still. But just wanted to point out one interesting notion is that while we're doing that, helping diplomats to kind of find the perfect platform, we actually realized that those platforms are not at all made in mind or to kind of be a private or whatever. So they're built for a wider audience, like industry, gaming, businesses, etc. Not so much on a specific issues or needs, specific needs or for diplomats or anyone who would like to kind of have a more personal meetings, as Shaun described. And what Shaun said, it's a crucial. So we would now say that now is a time not to kind of search a perfect platform, but actually demand a change in platforms which will introduce the things who are important for diplomatic meetings. For example, introduction of EIIS, basically put transcripts in our online rooms, translations, interpreters in our online room, reporting, note taking, or even recordings for the later recording. So none of this was actually in the platforms prior to a couple of years ago. I mean, no one would think about it. I mean, it was not so prominent in the platforms. But now, when everyone is pushed to kind of request those things, tech companies are, of course, there for just like finding a solution. Of course, making money. So we should actually demand a platform rather than kind of search for a perfect blend or use 2, 3, 5 platforms. We should do that now, but for the future, we should focus on actually demanding, not looking by. That's in short, but let's please discuss if there is any additional questions, etc. Again, our comprehensive platform list of platforms, or you can find it on the contact website. Andriana, if you can, please just drop the chat here drop the link here in the chat. And there, if you have some kind of emergency now, need to choose a platform again, you can find valuable inputs. But then again, think about the new home, maybe for the diplomats, new online home for the diplomats, which will be open on another level, kind of on another level of construction. Why is that important? Because, as you saw it from the main conference presentation of our Katarina Hone, and we did the research for diplomats, what is the thing that you kind of need to take care of most when you think about the new platform? Almost anonymously, they said it's a security and privacy and, of course, confidentiality of talks and others. But a bit on that, that's why it's Vlada here also with us, so he can maybe just point that on security. But Vlada, I will stop here. I will add anything else if there is a questions.
Thanks. A couple of quick takeaways from my side. One is what you mentioned. It's quite interesting that diplomacy is now moving, technically speaking, on platforms level, basically building up its work on something that was not envisaged for diplomacy. It was envisaged for gaming. It was envisaged for open conversation. It was mainly the proprietary platform software and so on. And now we have to find a way to adapt and change that for the purposes of diplomacy. Confidentiality being one of those aspects. And as I usually cover within these online courses that we have on online meetings and moderation, the challenge is that even now when we are discussing over Zoom, basically, we could be sitting one next to another in the same office, but still the signal, the video and voice travels all the way over the ocean to the servers of Zoom somewhere and then coming back. to the computer next to me. So this voyage of signals, and it can be copied, and it is technically copied in many on many levels around the world, and God knows who can have, at least theoretically, the access to that, from companies to law enforcement to criminals to just interested people. How do we make sure that we encrypt that in a right way, whether that's sufficient, and so on? So confidentiality is a big deal, and not the least, you can close everything, but I can still record the meeting now, and you can't know that I did it. In a more face-to-face setting, it's possible, but it's much harder to do that. But back to a question to you, Arvin, an interesting thing that you mentioned first, that this difference between observation and participation, where this is not a technological issue, it's actually the organizational issue. How do we organize meetings in such a way that we don't pretend to have people, but they're actually observing, but they're not equal to other participants? And the question for you is, are we more equal when we are online? We've heard this morning, and also from Shaun, there'll be less of traveling, and probably for some countries, developing countries, Pacific Islands always cope with travels around the world. It might be easier to connect, but at the same time, it might give us maybe the perception that we are equal online, but we might have different tools, different levels of the tools, the versions of the software. We might have different connections. Mokhtar was speaking this morning with problem with his connection.
Exactly.
The energy background, the power for that, the settings. Someone can have a really nice camera and visual setting. It impacts the discussions, the dominance and so on. The skills how to do that. Exactly. So are we actually more equal in this online space, or there might be counter effects of that when it comes to equality?
Vlada, in short, in practice, yes, but in theory, really not so much. And this is, of course, the issue of accessibility. And the early 2000s, we heard tech companies, telecoms, others saying, just leave it to the market. We will cover everything. Like every corner in Africa will have the same internet as you guys have in Washington, etc. But that basically didn't happen. It did not happen. And there is still not to mention number of unconnected people, but from those who are connected and can kind of participate on an equal footing, they are not actually on equal footing. From all of these particular issues you mentioned, are they have an HD fancy camera, which would they look better from their counterpart, visually, audio, and others, of course, bandwidth. And these are the questions that put us on an equal level of participation, but we're still not there. I would say we're still not there. Then again, one also thing to think about is the level of cyber hygiene. Not all of us online are perceiving this the same. So even those differences, which would be a cultural differences in a face-to-face meeting, like no need to lock the door or something like that, we're now presenting a kind of a different threats, different ways of how to do it, and different threats, to be honest. That would be in short. Thanks.
Thanks for that. And I'm seeing Jeffrey's comment. Jeffrey, if you wish, you can jump in. Certainly, if anyone wants to jump in, either share the comment or just raise a hand. But Jeffrey, if you want to...
Well, that's one of the things. When digital diplomacy really takes off, and we're in an environment where conferences are going online, there's still going to be the same levels of inequality, just as there are in diplomacy today. So in diplomacy today, some ambassadors will be driving brand new Mercedes, they'll be wearing the best suits, and they'll be living in the best chancelleries. And it's going to be the same when it all goes online. Some are going to have access to the best coders and some are not. And so, whether it's going to be equal or not, today is not equal. So, the digital world's not going to be equal either, I'm afraid.
And I think that's important to consider when we talk about this opportunity for being on equal footing, that there are limits to that. Now, whether it is different, whether a diplomat comes with Hyundai or Mercedes, or during the talk, it drops the connection drops, it might be different, functionally different. But this is something definitely we have to discuss more, and I guess we have to be very cautious when we talk about this sort of equality. We already went into time for coffee, so I will have a last sort of reflection from Arvin before we close this part. But if you want to go grab the coffee and come back, you can do that, and we'll still have a couple of minutes of break. Arvin, last question for you. I think what's different with these online environments, and might be different in future as well, is that you do have parallel tracks. We are seeing chat here. Maybe that's not always, or it wouldn't be used to that extent in formal multilateral discussions, that someone actually uses the chat while the discussion goes on. In the real setting, you have a neighbor, you can chat a little bit with a neighbor, or you can go grab a coffee. Here you have a chat, you have parallel conversations. So to what extent this changes the concept of the meetings, that you actually have to be, not only when you moderate the meeting, but when you organize, plan, and try to get the discussions, to pay attention to parallel tracks of discussions and what's happening somewhere else than on the main stage, if you wish. Arvin.
Absolutely. And in most cases, those parallel discussions actually are kind of beings from themselves. They are independent creatures. They're going in a different ways. And as you all know, it, like being in a chat, for example, online chat in a room, often chats are called troll box, because basically they can distract from the main event, or they can add a layer to the conversation, which can be a second layer of, or a tiered conversation, kind of things that are discussed privately, let's say like privately with video and audio, and things which are discussed in the chat kind of in a separate way. So implementation of two tracks, it's handy, it's really handy. But another thing which is unique to online, not so much offline world, is that you can easily be distracted. And everyone knows this now, especially in the age of Zoom and everything. I mean, you're a click away from something completely different, really interesting research, or I don't know, something which is kind of more interesting than this particular
you're
meeting.
home and then the baby jumps in and so on, as we have seen.
Yeah, those are of course unplanned situation, but this is like kind of your consciousness in telling you, okay, I will just click here and see what's going on right now in a capital or something like that. But then, of course, you're losing a track of discussion, and that all waters it down a bit. So there are pros, of course. You can have a tiered discussion, kind of first layer, second layer discussions with these parallel channels. You can easily draft a document together while you're on a call, for example. But on the other hand, it kind of introduces you, just like a really quick escape, which is often used, to be honest.
Okay, I'll just give a brief, because I saw there were a couple of comments in the chat. I'll give a brief floor to Andriana to go through them, and then we go grab a coffee and come back. Andriana.
Sorry, the unmute button wouldn't stick, which is quite often these days. We have comments on digital divide. There is quite an agreement in chat that it will be a major hurdle, and that digital diplomacy can increase it. Maria, for example, noted that there is no equality in all the aspects, and then maybe somebody has problems with their computer or, for example, internet connection. And then she also noted a problem that I know that quite a few of my colleagues at Diplo have, which is small children who, for example, cut their hair while they're in meetings, so they cannot stay focused on the conversation. Back to you, Vlada.
Thanks.
It was oddly particular, to be honest. This was yeah.
No, but that's interesting, and I'll close with that. A good colleague of ours, who is a senior diplomat, shared an anecdote from a real meeting where it was very tense situation and multilateral discussions, and then suddenly the button on his shirt went off and kicked straight ahead one of the main counterparties. And they all started laughing. And from that moment, the discussions started moving well. Well, maybe that should be sort of faked, so that, when you have a tense discussion, you just bring a kid who starts cutting your hair, and then everyone starts laughing, and you move on the discussion. Okay, we'll close with that. 5 minutes break. I know we've shortened it a little bit. Go grab your coffee, get your cigarette, go to the toilet, whatever you need, 5 minutes. And then we'll be back talking about transparency, maybe more of inclusiveness, and so on. Back to you in 5. We can start. For all of you that are back from the break, you can switch on the cameras. Feel free again to use the chat, raise the hand if you want to grab a mic. That's all allowed. And we are moving to the third part of our conversation today, which is on more or less transparency. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Kristin Eggeling with us. I hope the pronunciation is okay. Kristin is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Science, University of Copenhagen, Denmark. And she currently works on a research project on digitalization and diplomatic practices in the EU, which is funded by the European Research Council. Kristin, welcome. Well, let's start with this question of transparency. I remember one of those quotes, too much transparency and you're naked. How much transparency we have in this online space in diplomacy? Too much or too few?
Great, thank you so much, Vlada, and thank you for having me, and actually apologies for coming in a few minutes late. And as we just said, it kind of is this thing that all of a sudden now in this virtual world, we have to be in multiple places at the same time. And due to that, actually often miss pieces of information, pieces of discussions going on. It also relates a little bit to what Arvin was just saying, that we get really easily distracted and therefore again, can kind of miss out on things that are happening in the meeting where we're also supposed to be. And that actually immediately brings me to the point that I prepared a little bit as an opening statement for a discussion, maybe. Because maybe digitalization is not as great for transparency as we might think. So I kind of want to unpack a little bit this myth that you have also in the description of the panel, that doing diplomacy digitally leads to more transparency. And this kind of is, at least in the academic literature that I also work with a lot, something that's very celebrated. There is this idea that digitalization kind of makes the diplomatic backroom increasingly unnecessary. Stiff diplomatic protocol is not that important anymore, because now diplomats can speak directly to a large global audience that is connected through various kind of digital communication devices. But over the last 2 years, and I think it's actually very important to say also pre-COVID, we've been doing this research project on how digitalization changes kind of everyday diplomatic practice, so the actual making of negotiations. And what we hear from the field of Brussels, I think also a very particular setting of multilateral diplomacy, is that the feelings are very mixed, and that the discussions or the opinions whether digitalization or digital communication adds transparency in particular are very mixed and not very positive. And maybe I can just quickly give you 2 examples. So the first one links again to this argument about distraction. So one of the diplomats I've been working with quite a bit, who's kind of involved in the preparation of ambassadorial meetings in the EU, told me a story about how working digitally now all the time actually makes him very nervous, because he is afraid that people will miss out pieces of information, that people won't have the latest draft of a text, that people won't have the latest briefing notes, the latest speaking points. So all of these very practical things that are very important for especially how at the working group level diplomats coordinate and negotiate is kind of disrupted. And he says that's a really problematic thing, because in these pre-meetings and in the coordination, kind of the negotiation lines are agreed, and kind of he captured this feeling of stress that now he sends about 250 emails every day, and it's almost impossible to keep track that everybody has all the information. And if we kind of think about transparency as people having access to all the possible information, then we have just a practical hurdle here. And so kind of in that sense, working digitally is a factor of stress and a feeling that the process becomes less transparent just because it becomes more complicated to manage and to oversee. And a second example that kind of zooms out a little bit from the kind of everyday, like very micro level practices about this bigger question about what happens when we give the public insights into the dealings of diplomatic negotiations, whether that actually is a beneficial thing for diplomacy or let's say a good thing for international relations. And here, this is kind of this argument where, at least in the academic literature, there's this really positive narrative of opportunity that digital communication, digitalization offers transparency because it creates all these opportunities to connect to broader audiences and bring more members, more voices in, and that's very celebrated. But again, if we look at what the practitioners tell us is that transparency isn't only that something about negotiations is communicated to a global public, but transparency is also linked to negotiations between diplomats, and that's very much linked to the question of confidentiality. So here we had, for example, one ambassador from the EU telling us that when you add, for example, digital communication devices into negotiation rooms and you have effects like practitioner or diplomats start tweeting from negotiation rooms or something like this, that actually something is created that this particular diplomat called a false sense of transparency, where maybe parts of the public who are on the particular platform might feel like they get closer to what's going on behind closed doors, but actually the opposite happened behind the closed doors. There, this feeling of confidentiality goes away and breaks down. And then this particular ambassador told us what happens in situations like this when you feel like somebody else in the room is, we earlier spoke about recording, in this case, then tweeting out what you're saying, then actually what you will do is you won't say what you're saying anymore. And as he put it, the negotiation will move elsewhere. It will become even more separated, even more, let's say, transparency in the sense that all of the negotiation partners share this confidential space. So in this kind of second sense, it's digital tools can also hinder transparency because they kind of threaten this idea of confidential space, in addition to this feeling of maybe stress and a difficulty of managing the process, like in the first example. And so I think I just want to start out by saying, in the current situation, but also before, we can see that even though digitalization at first sight kind of promises more transparency, it actually often leads to, in practice, imperfect information sharing and kind of creating new issues for confidentiality, where the diplomats feel like they cannot exchange freely, which we, I think, can also interpret as a way of transparency.
Thanks, Kristin. Quite interesting points. I would probably take out two main blocks. One is related to what we can probably call this paradox of plenty. Too much information that makes it unviable to actually run through all of that, and having the, as you said, the impression you're actually missing pieces of information instead of being happy that you have everything on your screen. And the other one is this issue about confidentiality versus transparency, at least towards the broader public. Let me stick to the first one, and I encourage everyone to raise questions, thoughts, comments in the chat, or just raise a hand if you wish to jump in. To what extent this paradox of plenty is actually, if I can put it, increased because of different platforms that we have. The role of the private sector is quite important there. We have some sort of a fragmentation of channels, whether you're tweeting, Instagramming, TikToking, and then there is a geopolitical influence of all of that. Are there any reflections on how this geopolitics of technology and the private sector and this fragmentation of channels additionally impact the, diplomats being nervous about whether they're able to catch everything and follow?
think on this particular point, I mean, maybe one of the other panelists has a clear example, maybe from the diplomatic field, but I would almost only be able to argue on the basis of, from a sociological perspective, common sense, right? So we're in so many meetings at the same time, you can just immediately switch to another context. You're on this platform, also on all the other ones. I think it becomes very overwhelming, and this question of distraction and fatigue, I think, is a very serious one. So the question of kind of technological frustration, it doesn't really work, then you get really upset, and these kinds of things can actually, at least in what I've heard from the diplomats in Brussels, can have two effects, but it's always unclear which one is going to take. The first one is that everybody just kind of laughs about it and, oh, the platform doesn't work. Okay, well, I guess we have to make the best out of it, like the bouncing button, right? But other times, and this had actually happened many times in Brussels over the last couple of weeks, the meeting just gets canceled. It doesn't work. And then there's a lot of frustration and everything gets delayed. So I think, and it's never clear which one is it going to be. And maybe it just also depends on whether it's the first meeting of the day where the technology doesn't work, or it's the last meeting of the day, right? So maybe there's a bit of anecdotal reflections. Maybe one of the other participants has another idea.
Quite an important reflection. Arvin, you also commented there. Want to reflect briefly?
Just wanted to mention that this new paradigm of seeing your own face, and Kristin said that at the beginning. Unfortunately, this is not my first Zoom meeting today, and I guess for many of you it's not. But then related to the visuals, but also psychology, is that looking your own face like whole day on a screen, it took another toll on your psychological side. You know, it's like, and when you see it, you of course want to put yourself like in the best position, you know, to see what's going on, kind of to present yourself best way. And there are a couple of research, like medical research now, stating that this might be might be the reason why we feel so fatigued after all these meetings. Something we didn't encounter during in situ meetings, or encounter in less scale. But this seeing your own image, or seeing yourself how you're presented, I often joke it's like you're going to the streets wearing a mirror in front of you. So like entire day, it kind of took a different kind of psychological tool on us. That would be it. Thanks.
And Rana added that it really depends on how you look on camera, whether you look the same way as in real life. And well, we hope with all the filters and technologies, it should be we should be able to make it better than in real life. But I would add to this is also because of all these click away meetings that are so easily visited, and now you don't have to travel for a full conference. You can just pick a session at this conference and a session on that conference on the topic you're interested in, and basically you don't have time in between the meetings to think. It's mainly being at the meetings and listening, while in the previous life, in a way, you needed an hour at least in a city, or half an hour to walk from place A to place B. You have time to reflect, to think, even to relax a little bit. I think these are also important aspects, I guess, also in diplomatic life. Kristin, you can certainly reflect on that. I have another question for you, which is more on this, as you mentioned, the full sense of transparency, such as tweeting, right? And we are seeing some of the world leaders doing that massively, but not only them. To what extent is that actually linked to not the crisis necessarily, but also to the meetings? Could it be decreased if we, I don't know, we have a feeling that we have already been online enough, speaking on Zoom, so I'm not going to tweet that much anymore. I'm just done it. It's enough. Can this sort of turning online reduce our, readiness to tweet, share more publicly?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Here, my researcher hat says I would have to look into that before I can give you a definite answer. But I think it's actually something that could probably be relatively easily looked at if you just look at Twitter streams and just, for example, like just quantitatively how many tweets are being sent off. Because I think just, again, anecdotally from both what practitioners say, but I think also what we ourselves feel. I mean, I feel very happy at the end of the day to close the computer and get away from the screen. But now I got very excited about that second point. Can you repeat your first question, please?
No, I'm not even sure which one I wanted to to raise, but I do have another thought. And by the way, I mean, the point of this discussion is to actually open questions more than I don't think we can give that many answers. But probably the last question, unless someone wants, I didn't see any raised hand or comments, Andriana, correct me if I'm wrong, but I couldn't see any discussions in the chat. But please feel free to reflect in the chat or just raise a hand and we'll pass the floor to you. Maybe the last question for you is when it comes to confidentiality. Are diplomats, I mean, again, it's food for thought. We don't need the exact response. To what extent are diplomats actually aware or afraid that the traditional confidentiality that they had in corridors, or even, I mean, you can arrange a coffee meeting between two of us in a private Zoom or whatever platform meeting, and it's going to be encrypted, it's going to be private. But it goes through various channels online. You can't really guarantee that it's 100% bulletproof confidential because it's digital. Is there a feeling among diplomats that things are never going to be changed and you can't rely on online, no matter how much encryption or tools you use? Is the understanding of confidentiality online changing?
Maybe two things on this. The first thing, I think, at least what we see in the field we study, is that they're trying to, as hard as possible, go back to the face-to-face meeting and try to develop strategies to have these meetings, even if it means sitting very far away and with a face mask, but that's still considered to be better than talking in these meetings. Also because I think it was mentioned a little bit earlier already, in these multilateral diplomatic settings, it's the people who are at the inner circle meeting table who are actually taking part in the meeting, but normally it's also many, many more meetings in kind of the back rows. It's the people reporting, it's the people preparing the speaking points. There's this whole apparatus, right? At a council meeting, there's like 200 people in the room. And that's probably going to be unlikely to happen just because it's with these social distancing restrictions. But still, for example, the ambassadors in the European Union were actually just missing one of their physical meetings at the very beginning of March because there was somebody who had tested positive for COVID in the circle, but otherwise they kept meeting under just very, very strict hygiene measures. So, and I think that to link that back to confidentiality, that says that in diplomacy, this confidentiality is also a sense, a feeling, this kind of the atmosphere of the meeting, that you have to have this kind of real, almost physical contact, even if it's bodies far apart, but that's extremely important, and that they will do everything to get back to that. Again, you had a second question. I think my brain is just zoomed out.
So you reflected on the confidentiality, on the confidentiality part. Excellent. Thank you, Kristin. Let's move to the last part of the discussion with back to Professor Jeffrey Robertson. So we'll discuss the permanent shifts in diplomatic practice. And Jeffrey is an associate professor at the Yonsei University and a visiting fellow at the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy and at the Australian National University. I know, Jeffrey, you've prepared also a video for us and some interesting reflections. So let me pass the screen straight ahead to you, Jeffrey.
Okay, great. You know, I was originally going to be making 2 points. One, that video conferences will not go away, and two, that digital diplomacy will soon go even further. But, well, I think point one is already made. I think everyone understands that video conferences are not going away, and we're going to be with them far into the future. We all know that video conferences are not so effective. We know that you know, all the traditional skills of diplomats, subtlety of language, directness, clarity, persuasion, emotion, body language, they don't operate in the online environment. So if we expect that video conference diplomacy is not enough, then we can also expect that there's going to be another innovation further down the track, or the next technology, and it's going to be replaced. And already there's developers out there who are looking towards the next step in digital diplomacy beyond the video conference. And one of these areas is computer gaming. And I was fascinated to talk to a game developer who created a concept video for me after we talked about the drawbacks of diplomacy by video conference. So I'm going to play this video and let you watch the video as I'll talk to the video. So this is about computer gaming, open world gaming, which is a type of video game that allows players to explore and pursue objectives in a virtual world. They are immersive, interactive, graphics-intensive gaming platforms that have the potential to replicate real-life events. So such gaming platforms would allow diplomats to maintain a recognizable identity. It would allow them to maintain their own identity. Character modeling in gaming has developed exponentially in recent years. And today, it's virtually indistinguishable between simulation and reality. It allows diplomats to build trust and reputation. The gaming environment allows regular, repeated interactions. So according to some gamers, to the point of being friends. For diplomats, professional collegiality. It allows diplomats to sustain the nuances of communication. Face tracking and body tracking technologies allow the communication of subtlety, clarity, and directness through facial expressions and even body language. It also allows diplomats to maintain discretion. Gaming environments have a mix of public and private space, with certain games having proximity-enabled interaction. So basically being able to converse with others within earshot and not being overheard by those outside of earshot. It would also allow diplomats to maintain facets of protocol, things such as seating arrangements and table arrangements. It would allow them to maintain control over public diplomacy, such as artworks, decor, public and media interaction, and also would allow them to maintain secure connections from the multilateral conference to their secure national platform, so they can still get told off by their supervisor or even the big boss. So I don't know how many of you actually play computer games out there, but there are incredible open world simulations that are eerily accurate in their replication of the real world. And as computer processing power increases and the top-line graphic cards become the norm, recreating the world of diplomacy and gaming is more than conceivable. It's the next logical step. So what does this mean? Well, it means that video conference diplomacy may be what the airship was to transport. Airships allowed travel over the Atlantic, but because of their drawbacks, they never actually replaced the ocean liner. But within 20 years, people were squeezed into economy class with peanuts and a Chardonnay in each hand, crossing the Atlantic in airplanes. And airships were basically just a stepping stone to the airplane. So video conference diplomacy could also actually be just a stepping stone to a more digitally enabled future for diplomacy. So what I'm getting at is we're not actually witnessing a permanent shift in diplomatic practice, far from it. What we're seeing is just one very small step in the evolution of diplomatic practice. And, there's a lot of discussions about how video conference diplomacy doesn't allow you to exercise all the normal diplomatic skills. But, well, face-to-face interaction is basically just a mode of communication. We know it as the best mode, the simplest mode, the easiest mode, but it's still just a mode, just like letter writing, town crying, engraving stone tablets, telephones, faxes, or video conferences. We know that face-to-face interaction is ineffective for diplomacy in certain circumstances, when it's used by unskilled diplomats or political leaders, or in certain circumstances when distance is critical to maintain dialogue. So face-to-face interaction is not diplomacy. Diplomacy is the exercise of tact, discretion, modesty, the mediation of strange groups, and this can still occur in a gaming environment. So perhaps as we go into the future, diplomacy will remain exactly the same as it is today. It'll just be a different medium which it's occurring through.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I guess we should give a like 10 seconds pause now for everyone to digest. I have two questions for you. Some of those we've already raised in the previous exchange over email, but and then again, the chat and the floor is open to anyone who wants to jump in. The first one is related to this intangible aspects of face-to-face communications that we just cannot replace, if there is such a thing. And I was thinking that, and that's probably a joint brainstorming by the entire group, what are these irreplaceable elements of a face-to-face contact that currently we don't see even these technologies will be able to replace? Is there that basically enable bonds and trust among people? So is it the feeling of a physical presence of a person? Is it the proximity? You mentioned that, and I think, you know, the proximity in different cultures, and you know, the stories about Latin American or Spanish person and an Asian person, which have a completely different understanding when someone should talk and what is this fair distance between them and so on. Is it about smells? Is it about small little incidents and being spontaneous, as we mentioned, spilling the coffee or you know, the button which flows away from your t-shirt, from your shirt, which you cannot simulate in online environments, but they're still necessary. So any thoughts from you, Jeffrey? What are these elements which are irreplaceable? And also a question for the others. Well,
actually, I think this is not so much a element of diplomacy, you know, spilling the coffee, so on. This is an element of generational difference. As we mentioned earlier, you know, there's young people who are growing up now who have grown up with gaming. They've lived in these simulated environments for, you know, much longer than us, and they know how to spill the coffee in a gaming environment. There are things you can do in a gaming environment, such as spilling the coffee to draw attention or to distract and so on. I mean, this happens in the gaming environment. And, you know, if we're talking about, you know, diplomacy really becoming and being an enabled diplomatic digital environment, then these sort of things are going to be the new spilling of the coffee. And, you know, it will be just a different medium that diplomacy occurs through. You know, the diplomat scholars of the past who talked about, you know, skills such as experience, integrity, intelligence, resource, good temper, you know, all of those, Francois de Cailler and Nicholson, you know, skills of the ideal diplomat, they're all going to still be there, but they're just going to be in a different medium. That's the only difference. But of course, there's another big problem there, and that's a digital divide, which has been pointed out many times. As that digital divide increases and increases, then we're going to have basically two levels of diplomacy, which I think is quite a frightening thing.
Thanks. Kristin had a comment. Kristin.
Yes, Jeffrey, I thought you said it so nicely that diplomacy is maybe not the face-to-face meeting, but it's the exercise of kind of tact, modesty, politeness. You said a very beautiful row of different terms. Maybe you could just repeat them, and we could talk about that. What actually is the essence?
Sure. So the essence of diplomacy is, well, it's just the description of what is the ideal diplomat and the ideal diplomacy. And these were written by scholar diplomats throughout history. You can go right back to the 16th century where they're using the same traits. And Francois de Cailler used these traits, and then Harold Nicholson repeated them in his text in the 1930s. So the way he put it was that, well, he put it in a rather gender non-neutral way, but he included all the elements of things such as experience, integrity, intelligence, resource, good temper, modesty, moderation, discretion, patience, and tact. And they're the main ones. A little bit of altruism also helps, and I think that was added in there somewhere. But
I think you'll have to type it in the chat because no, we have the recording or rewind it. But I think it is a Pandora's box to open. We are not going to open it now, at least not continue. time is up. But I think talking about what is the essence of diplomacy, and particularly because everyone talks about this lack of physical contacts and informal chat, coffee, and all of that. I mean, practicing diplomats. It will be interesting to dive more deeply into, maybe Kristin, that's a task for you as a researcher, and Jeffrey, into what are these elements and whether we can really replace everything, or there are some elements which we cannot replace, and maybe we don't have to. Maybe there will be, as Jeffrey said, maybe there'll be other aspects which are more important to new generations, but not the same old ones. Time is up. We'll have to wrap up. I'll just put a food for thought for all of you, one step further from what Jeffrey mentioned now as a virtual reality or a 3D environment. Imagine the virtual reality and the glasses where you can actually walk and be in the environment. Imagine the augmented reality, which can build people around you in your venues where you're physically, and all of these things which we can look in blockbusters and Black Mirror and other series. Maybe they can bring also some very positive aspects that can replace what we miss in physical contact. Food for thought. We don't have much time, so we have to close with that. And I invite you to come back to the plenary session. We'll wrap up and we'll have some interesting reflections on discussions from other groups. Many thanks for joining this breakout session, and see you in Adriana. I guess you can just pass the link to the plenary room again, the chat, and just move to the main plenary room and see you there. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Jeffrey, as well.
Thank you.